So I was asked to talk about stigma, and there are different ways I can talk about stigma. For a long time I worked on an anti-stigma program that was conducted in 20 countries around the world, run by the World Psychiatric Association. We used to talk about how you can try and reduce the effect of stigma in the community. Believe me, it's hard. So I'm not going to talk about that so much today. I'm going to talk about stigma and what it is and how pervasive it is, but I only want to talk about how it affects people who have mental illness and people who treat those with mental illness, and believe me, it has quite devastating effects. And so it's important for us to understand just how it works in making our work and our recovery much harder. So, who hasn't seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Anyone not seen it? So everybody's seen it. So I'm going to tell you, you know it's this movie is made about 1974 from a Ken Kesey novel, and it's about someone who gets treated very badly in a psychiatric hospital. I'll tell you one or two things about it that you may not know. You probably know that it was shot at Oregon State Hospital. A couple of things you may not know is that the psychiatrist who appears in it actually was a psychiatrist from the state hospital, and he subsequently came here, Jim Shore, to be the head of the Department of Psychiatry in Colorado. The other thing that's not so well known is that the filmmakers were given the opportunity to have people who were patients in the hospital be extras or patients in the movie itself. But the filmmakers said no. Do you want to guess why they said no? They didn't look weird enough. So this is just an illustration of how we live with a stereotype of people with mental illness that is really nothing like the real McCoy, nothing like people with mental illness. So in the filmmakers' minds, you had to look weird, you had to act weird in order to be mentally ill, and you had to do that all the time. Here's another example of stigma and how one can fight it, because part of the stereotype of being mentally ill is that you're violent, you're a crazed killer. This is the Death of Superman issue from DC Comics, and originally, not known to many people, the killer of Superman was going to be an escapee from an interplanetary insane asylum. And DC Comics was talked out of it by mental health advocates and then denied that that had ever been their plan. Nevertheless, you can still find copies of the original drawing of the killer who had the tatters of a straitjacket flying off his shoulders. So, through the efforts of an organization that's run by NAMI, the Stigma Clearinghouse, they were able to stop that piece of plot from being distributed. So likewise, here was another series on television, ABC television, from the 80s, I think, maybe 90s, from the 90s. It was called Wonderland. It was shot in, it was supposed to be based in an psychiatric emergency room in New York. And in the first couple of episodes, there were several examples of people with mental illness stabbing pregnant psychiatrists and other violent actions like that. Again, NAMI raised a ruckus, and although they'd filmed all 13 episodes, it was taken off the air within the airing of 2. So it is possible to affect the distribution of these terribly damaging stereotypic images, but you have to be very alert to it. So here's some more examples of how the stereotype of mental illness is perpetuated by the entertainment media. If you look at daytime soap operas, this is data from the 80s, admittedly, but continues to be very similar. 72% of mentally ill characters in the soap operas on TV were violent. 22% of them were killers. There's some more recent data from 2007 in prime time, 37% of characters with mental illness in primetime TV are violent criminals, whereas of those people without mental illness, only 4% are violent criminals. New Zealand, you'll find that there's many references, and here, of course, many references to, in children's TV, to mentally ill characters, references to mental illness, in which case they're portrayed either as comical or villainous. So there's been a lot of surveys and research and study of stigma, going back famously to this study in Illinois in the 1950s by Nunnally. And the conclusion from his entire book of research is that old people and young people, highly educated people and people with little formal education, all tend to regard the mentally ill as relatively, now remember these adjectives, dangerous, dirty, unpredictable, and worthless. And that's just the beginning of the stereotype. Now, as he said, in short, all things bad. So you just have to imagine the burden that people take on when they're told they have a mental illness. And that is what we grow up with from our very earliest years until, in fact, until late life. We still carry that stereotype around with us as what we mean when we say mental illness. Of course, it isn't true. So here's some news media images and how the stereotype gets perpetuated. A study of the news media in 1983, conducted by someone who actually is a communications person who's married to a psychiatrist currently here in Boulder, found that those same misconceptions about mental illness were perpetuated in the news media images that were published. And then a few years later, they repeated the study, found there'd been some improvement, less focus on crime in every reference to mental illness, more on illness and treatment, but dangerousness was still a very prominent part of the stereotype. Same thing is true in other countries. In Britain, news media images, people who are mentally ill portrayed usually as violent criminals, negatively. Accounts of violence are 4 times more common than sympathetic reports in that study in the 90s. Common misconceptions now that are spread by these images. And these come from the research work from the anti-stigma campaign that I was working on for 15 years or so in 20 countries. In the UK, his paper that where 50% of people who were surveyed believe that setting fire to public buildings is a very likely consequence of mental illness. In the US, 58% of people surveyed would cite lack of discipline as a cause of mental illness. And 93% blame drug and alcohol abuse as a common cause. People are seen as being more responsible for suffering from mental illness than AIDS patients or the obese or anybody else. Other common misconceptions. In Madrid, we found that over 50% of family members of people with mental illness believe that someone with schizophrenia should not study, drive, or have children. In Austria, 22% of psychiatrists, and you have to know that in Austria, psychiatrists also sort of include a number of neurologists, so it's sort of a mixed bag. 22% of people seen as psychiatrists believe that people with schizophrenia have split personality, which of course is just totally inaccurate. Only 7% of journalists believe drug treatment to be effective in schizophrenia in Austria at that time. So these are the common misconceptions that come up again and again, and especially when we work with the police. We did a lot of police training here over a course of years, and we found these misconceptions are very commonly held by the police, and they were held by the police even after we'd put a lot of educational effort into working with them. So surveys in ahead and at the tail end of the education revealed that people thought that schizophrenia is caused by bad parenting, that nobody recovers from schizophrenia, and that isn't true. There's a natural recovery rate from schizophrenia, has been throughout the 20th century, of 20% complete recovery. That people with schizophrenia are usually violent, and people with schizophrenia are unable to make any rational decisions. Now, the misconceptions that the police could never shake was that people with schizophrenia are usually violent and that they're unable to make any rational decisions. They would always adhere to one of those beliefs. And it's because the police are in a special situation. They only get exposed to people who are mentally ill when they're acutely disturbed, when they have to bring them into treatment. They never get exposed to people with mental illness after they've recovered and are doing well. And even though I used to take along a librarian who had schizophrenia and had been doing well for a few decades to talk to them, it still didn't change their view that people with schizophrenia are usually violent. Discrimination comes from this stereotype. 40% of US landlords automatically reject any applicant with mental illness. In Greece, 42% of people won't employ someone with mental illness, whereas 90% would employ someone who was physically disabled. In Britain, over 2/3 of mental health managers have had to confront "not in my backyard" campaigns. That is, where the neighbours object to the placement of a residential facility or group home in their neighbourhood. And you think, oh well, that's Britain, it wouldn't happen here in Boulder. But some of us who were around when we first opened Colorado Recovery, and you know that's on a residential street, will know there was a big campaign to stop us from opening, and we were on the front page of the Boulder Daily Camera, off and on for a period of weeks. And that included neighbours who were mental health therapists. And in Britain, 50% of people with mental illness report unfair treatment from health professionals, including emergency rooms and general practitioners. So just a few years ago, I did a little bit of a survey for the part of a bigger project of people with schizophrenia in Denver and Boulder, 25 people, and talking about discrimination, people could see some advantages to being labelled with mental illness when it came to applying for disability or obtaining reduced price housing. The disadvantages, they said, were from being treated for physical health problems. They ran into stigma in those situations, likewise from the police, and likewise they thought from their own family members. But more they saw big disadvantage when it came to church congregations and to finding a job, but still only moderate. But when you ask them more specifically, how much trouble have you had, to the extent of have you felt shunned by people who know your diagnosis, or a little, felt humiliated, yes, by mental health staff, but a lot felt you need to hide your diagnosis and stopped you from applying for work. So the real effect is you may feel you're at a moderate disadvantage or there might be discrimination in working, but you don't actually apply for the job because you're afraid to confront that discrimination. And here, perhaps, is the most awful slide I can show you. This is a slide of victimization of people with mental illness from a study conducted in, I think, inner city Chicago. And of course, you realize that our treatment of people with mental illness is such that many of them end up homeless or housed in the most violent and poverty-stricken areas of the city. So people with mental illness in those areas were 12 times more frequent to be frequently victims of a crime of violence, 17 times more likely to be raped, 8 times more frequently robbed, 15 times more frequently assaulted, and 140 times more likely to have had some form of personal theft. So that's the real violence in the story of mental illness. It's what's inflicted on people themselves. So that's the first part. That's just stigma and how it affects us through stereotyping and discrimination and misconceptions. And let me take a break at that point and say any questions, because the next bit is going to be about how all this affects people with the illness and affects us who are